I have had the pleasure of worshiping with you all a few times before since I arrived in Topeka over the summer, but this is my first time joining you from such a height. When I'm not here, I am usually in the very southeast corner of the state at a parish that I serve, St. Mary's in Galena. I will confess I much prefer the commute here as I live in Bethany House, and it's a whole 5 minutes versus 3 hours. Because my job involves quite a bit of travel, I find myself, being perpetually late, almost always feeling a little underprepared. I find myself uncomfortably identifying with the foolish bridesmaids of this morning's parable. I would love to see myself as the wise bridesmaids, ready for any eventuality, toting twice the amount of oil I might need, just in case. With the amount of worrying and catastrophizing I regularly indulge in, you might think I would see myself as in the wise bridesmaid's shoes. But if I'm honest, I know exactly how much good that worrying has ever done me, and it's close to zero. So how do we find hope in this awkward, uncomfortable parable? And this is, I think, one of the most challenging of Jesus' parables. To begin with, it utilizes as metaphor Jewish wedding customs, the details and nuances of which are almost entirely unfamiliar to us in the 21st century Western world. More to the point, however, parables never are single-answer, clear allegories. They are intended to communicate challenging truths, and each perspective in the story can reveal something more. As Christian author Debbie Thomas poses, maybe this is what we are supposed to do with Jesus' parables. Treat them like a diamond, holding them up to the light and examining each facet. Maybe we are supposed to let their meanings open out, wider and wider and wider. Maybe the truths the parables reveal are various and infinite, impossible to lock down. With these many possibilities of interpretation before us, I invite you to step into this parable with me this morning, listening for the familiar promises of hope in a challenging story. The theme is the parousia, Christ's return at the end of the world, the delayed coming. Consider first the community for whom this gospel is being written. These are the first-generation Christians who thought Christ's return would happen within their lifetime. And they are now facing the reality that that delay is much longer than they anticipated. In this extended waiting, doubt creeps in. Did we miss it? Was he ever coming back in the first place? Considering that the Thessalonians in Paul's epistle were already facing this anxiety, it is no wonder that inspiring vigilance was of chief concern for the gospel addressing the Matthean community some 30 years later. Even though it is already a delayed return for them, there is still a real sense of urgency for the writers of this gospel, for Paul, for the early church. Most of that urgency has worn off for us across the intervening 2,000 years, but occasionally it bubbles up now and then, especially in times of war and global crisis. And yet, we do not know the hour. Trying to imagine or discern when the parousia will arrive is a distraction, I think, from what is really being asked of us in this parable. Therefore, stay alert, says Jesus at the very end. If guessing the hour of the bridegroom's arrival is impossible, how do we stay alert? What is the real work of preparation? Perhaps it is presence rather than preparedness that is most important. The plot in this parable builds to the point at which the bridegroom arrives. And who is there to meet him? What does it mean to meet the groom? The bridesmaids gather, bringing their lamps, and they all go out to wait. Some have prepared extra oil, some have not. They all fall asleep. Then comes the cry, "Look, here is the bridegroom. Come out to meet him." And at this crucial moment, some are there, and some have left. When those who did not bring enough oil find themselves unprepared, rather than sharing the surplus of the others, the wise bridesmaids tell them to go out and buy some more for themselves. I always thought that was kind of rude, or at least pretty cold-hearted. There are many ideas about what the oil represents. Maybe it's all the good deeds one has done in one's life. Maybe it's strength of faith or spiritual fortitude. Whatever it is, I can let the wise bridesmaids off the hook because I get the sense that it's something that cannot actually be shared. Something that's impossible to mete out to another who doesn't have enough. At any rate, there are some who brought oil and some who didn't. But I think the real issue in this parable is that there were those who stayed and those who left. All that was being asked, truly, was the meeting, being there to greet the bridegroom. All that God was asking for was their presence, not what they had or what they had done, but simply the bridesmaids themselves. What could have been done differently, I wonder? The problem at the end is not that there wasn't enough light. After all, there were still only 5 lamps lit when the groom arrived. It was that the bridegroom didn't know the bridesmaids when they came late. They weren't there to meet them. And when they knocked at the door, he does not know them. Therefore, keep alert. Not be prepared or keep your wicks burning or make sure you have enough oil, but keep alert. Stay awake. Stay. Again, Debbie Thomas states beautifully and simply, "You are more valuable than your oil supply, so stick around." The foolish bridesmaids assume that their oil supply is more important to them, that is more important than the groom or their presence at his party. Only a bridesmaid who trusts in the groom's deep and unconditional compassion, only a bridesmaid who knows that the groom has light and oil to spare, only a bridesmaid who understands that her presence, messy and imperfect though it may be, is of intrinsic value to the groom, only she will find the honesty and the courage to stay. This is the courage that these bridesmaids lack in the parable. So 5 of them scatter, and the whole suffers as a result. There are 5 fewer lights, 5 fewer bridesmaids to celebrate with joy the groom's arrival. The loss is communal, extensive, and real. Again, it's not about being wise or being foolish, but about being present. Present when you feel woefully unprepared, when you feel foolish, fearful even that you don't have what you need to face what is arriving. In his commentary on this week's gospel, Lutheran pastor David Luce says that this kind of waiting, the waiting that Matthew is encouraging through his parable, is hard. We're waiting for something way overdue, something that we are not even sure will ever come. Waiting that involves active preparation even when we are not sure what we should be preparing for. It is a challenging kind of waiting, and one that is often accompanied by no small amount of anxiety. But Matthew still has answers for us. How do we endure this waiting? we stay alert. Be aware of what is going on around you. Be aware of the injustices, the hurt, the struggle, but the joy as well. This awareness opens our eyes to the pain of waiting for the kingdom of God, for the reconciliation of all to God. But also, it opens our eyes to the moments of joy and the moments in which God's kingdom is present with us now. We may not always identify with the foolish bridesmaids. For me, failures tend to stick out in my memory more than successes, but I've had times when I felt like I was really on top of things. I arrived on time, I brought my lamp, my wick was trimmed, I had plenty of oil. So when we feel like the wise bridesmaid, what can we do for those around us who are struggling in that long night of waiting? Maybe we can't lend them our oil, but the last thing we should do to those who are struggling is to send them away. We may not be able to lend our oil, but we can invite them to stand with us in the light of our own lamps. The number one job of the bridesmaids was to be present to meet the groom. How can we then be present to one another? How can we love one another as much as we love ourselves, as much as we love Jesus? As the late Frederick Buechner wrote, our happiness is all mixed up with each other's happiness, and our peace with each other's peace. Our own happiness, our own peace, can never be complete until we find some way of sharing it with people who, the way things are now, have no happiness and know no peace. Jesus calls us to show forth this truth, live this truth. Be the light of the world, he says. Where there are dark places, be the light especially there. Consider, perhaps, the oil as our resilience. Each brought the oil they thought they would need. Dividing between the foolish and the wise is misleading. Parables may be infinitely multifaceted, but I am certain that Jesus is not asking us to discern who among us is the wise and who is the foolish, because we all, each, are one at one time or another. The message is to be resilient. Stay faithful, stay the course, stay. And staying, being resilient, is infinitely more possible when we lean on one another, when we refuse to leave one another in the dark. That is our role as the church. That is what it means to be Christ's followers then and now, bearing Christ's light in the world and sharing his message of hope.